Failure to stand against the use of chemical weapons would weaken prohibitions against other weapons of mass destruction and embolden Assad's ally, Iran.
Now on Newsmax Exclusive, President Obama making his case for diplomacy and potentially for airstrikes in Syria to the American people. But will his policy work, and can he sway public sentiment?
Newsmax editor David Patton goes one-on-one with Newt Gingrich. Why the former House Speaker says the president's handling of the Syrian crisis will impact the presidency and perception of the U.S. abroad.
Hello, I'm David Nelson from Money News here in New York. Coming up next, I'm going to talk about my interview this week with Hedge Eye's Keith McCullough. We've all seen the events unfold surrounding Syria, and now Russian President Vladimir Putin is getting involved in the mix. Keith has a very interesting idea for the president. See you then.
Plus, we take a hard look at the NYPD's controversial surveillance and counterterrorism program with Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and author of The Enemies Within, Matt Apuzzo.
And if you or a loved one is too frail for heart surgery, you won't want to miss our interview with a doctor and pioneer who may have a life-saving solution. His prescription for heart health straight ahead. Newsmax Exclusive starts now. Hello and welcome to Newsmax TV. I'm John Bachman.
And I'm Kathleen Walter.
President Obama hoping for a diplomatic solution in Syria, but keeping the threat of military action on the table.
This as pressure mounts here at home and abroad for the president to back away from launching military strikes on Syria amidst accusations the Assad regime used chemical weapons on its own people.
If we fail to act, the Assad regime will see no reason to stop using chemical weapons.
In a speech this week, the president told the American people that he believes the threat of military force could potentially be necessary. He asked the Senate to delay a vote authorizing him to launch strikes on Syria. The president's speech came on the heels of this threat from Bashar Assad on Monday in an interview with CBS's Charlie Rose.
Will there be attacks against American bases in the Middle East if there's an airstrike?
You should expect everything. You should expect everything.
On Thursday, Russian President Vladimir Putin had a warning to the American people. In a New York Times editorial, Putin said the potential strike by the United States against Syria will result in more innocent victims and escalation, potentially spreading the conflict far beyond Syria's borders. He added, "We must stop the language of force and return to the path of civilized, diplomatic, and political settlement." Secretary of State John Kerry met with his Russian counterpart in Switzerland Thursday and discussed a Russian plan for Syria to turn over all of its chemical weapons to avoid a U.S. military strike. The U.S. wants to make sure any plan would include a binding resolution from the UN Security Council.
If Assad's chemical weapons stockpiles can be secured and removed from his possession, absent military force, that would be a very good thing.
But that's a big if. U.S. officials say they'll agree to the Russian proposal only if it can be sure that Syria turns over all of its chemical weapons. An estimated 1,000 tons of chemical agents are believed to be spread throughout the country.
Syria is considered by most experts as a chemical weapons superpower. I would say our knowledge of the exact location of these weapons is at best imperfect at this point.
Now, among the president's more vocal critics on Syria and other things as well is former House Speaker Newt Gingrich.
Newsmax editor David Patton sat down with Speaker Gingrich, who just signed on as co-host of CNN's Crossfire. David has this report from the Capitol.
Kathleen and John, former House Speaker Newt Gingrich was in rare form during his wide-ranging, exclusive Newsmax interview. We covered a large number of topics, and he was particularly critical about the way President Obama has handled the situation in Syria. And we're very excited to have you with us today.
Well, I'm glad to be with you.
Now, in the debut program, Senator Rand Paul said that it wasn't so much America's credibility that's at stake, but rather the president's personal credibility that seems to be possibly drawing America into another war in the Middle East. Do you agree with that analysis? And has Obama in his handling of this matter possibly weakened the presidency in a sense?
Well, I think Senator Rand Paul has been pretty correct in his analysis of what's going on. I think that first of all, the United States is the most powerful country in the world. Whatever happens in the next few weeks over Syria, the United States will be the most powerful country in the world. So it doesn't seem to me very likely that you're going to see the United States lose prestige. But you could see Barack Obama lose a lot of prestige. And frankly, he brought it on himself. I mean, this has been so badly mishandled that I think you have to go back to President Jimmy Carter to have anything comparable in national security in terms of just totally flat failing to meet the test of competence.
One of the things you talked about is agreement that it is great news that Russia is getting involved diplomatically in trying to resolve the Syria issue. I'm curious, can we really be confident, though, that we're going to have a positive outcome, given the fact that until yesterday, Syria, of course, would not even admit that it possessed chemical weapons?
That's right. It is kind of ironic that you have President Assad now prepared to give up the weapons that he didn't have. And I think that just tells you a little bit about how the world works. But I would say Ronald Reagan had it right when he said trust but verify. The Russians have taken a positive step. I suspect they have privately put enormous pressure on the Syrians. And as a result, the Syrians have said they would go along with it. If, in fact, in the next few days, you could get a genuine agreement that the Syrians will identify their chemical warfare systems, and that they will then allow the United Nations to destroy them, I think that would be dramatically better than a very tiny bombing campaign that frankly won't accomplish anything.
The bottom line for former Speaker Gingrich is that he is certainly no fan of the current president and believes that unless he changes course, that America could continue to suffer a diminution of credibility on the national scene.
And David, did Speaker Gingrich give you any indication of how President Obama's handling of the Syrian crisis and the domestic affairs could impact 2016?
Well, that's a good question about the domestic politics and how Obama's problems may affect 2016. The House Speaker said it's a little bit too early to project that. He did talk about some very strong potential GOP contenders for the nomination. He mentioned Chris Christie, for example, certainly Rand Paul, who was on his debut program, CNN Crossfire. So he knows that people like Scott Walker, the governor of Wisconsin, is waiting in the wings as well. One of the interesting aspects of what he shared with us is that he believes Obama fatigue could even outpace Bush fatigue by the time we're finished with the second Obama term.
Thursday, the Assad regime denied that the threat of a U.S. military attack led to the decision to place Syria's chemical weapons under international supervision. Assad reportedly has said that this decision was based on Russia's suggestion alone. There are also questions in Washington. There continues to be a debate about what actually brought on this Russian proposal of diplomacy. Was it Kerry's apparent gaffe in London? Was it the anti-war movement in the libertarian wing of the GOP, as Senator Rand Paul has suggested? Or was it the threat of U.S. force? During a recent Newsmax exclusive, Senator Johnny Isakson of Georgia tells us despite what Assad and Putin may claim, it is certainly the latter.
The power of the United States of America is always the most persuasive thing we have, as long as the will of the American people is united behind it. And I think the potential that the United States military carries to carry out the stated goal of getting rid of the gas was a major factor in the people looking for a diplomatic solution. Assad was not going to come up with it on his own, but the Syrian enabler is Russia. And once the Russians came forward with that, I think Assad immediately said they would sign the chemical weapons accord agreement, which they're one of the 4 countries in the world that aren't a signatory to, which indicates we got their attention. So hopefully that's what will happen.
And so for now, any vote before the full Senate authorizing the use of military force is on hold. And while the diplomatic option could potentially take Syria's chemical weapons completely out of the picture, would it also serve the purpose of deterring Assad and others from using them in the future? We posed that question to Wisconsin Senator Ron Johnson, a member of the Foreign Relations Committee.
I'm absolutely open to it. It's really what we should be doing. Let's face it, one of the stated goals of President Obama's strategy here is to deter the use of chemical weapons. Obviously, if you've got Russia at least talking, if not putting realistic pressure on the Assad regime to give up its chemical weapons stockpile, or at least to secure them, put those under international control, that certainly is going to deter the use. And, John, part of my problem in this strategy of the Obama administration of military action, we've signaled it, we've lost the element of surprise. I'm concerned that ineffective military action, let's face it, that's what we're talking about right now. They've dispersed those assets. People are talking about a calibrated, a tailored, a unbelievably limited response. That to me is almost worse than no action.
As of Thursday, it remains uncertain if or when the House will bring the resolution authorizing President Obama to strike Syria to the House floor. In a Newsmax exclusive, Representative Ted Poe, a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, says the House would overwhelmingly vote down the resolution.
The president is really campaigning for war. Country's war weary. We need to have a vote in the House of Representatives and in the Senate on this very issue, one way or the other. He needs to know that the American Congress does not support a war with Syria. So I say let's go ahead and vote.
I asked Representative Poe what are the lessons we should draw today in dealing with the current crisis with Syria and its ally Iran, and here's what he had to say.
Well, the first thing we need to understand is that there is a serious civil war going on in Syria between the government and the rebels. On the side of the government, Russia, Iran, Hezbollah, terrorist organization, and then on the side of the rebels, you have the Free Syrian Army, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Qatar, Egypt, and Al-Qaeda. You have a religious war going on. You have two terrorist groups fighting each other. This is a civil war. The United States should not get involved in this civil war.
Was President Obama in his primetime address able to sway a skeptical public and move the needle on Syria? Well, polls find public support is fading for an attack. A CNN ORS International survey shows that 60% of those questioned believe it is not in the national interest for the U.S. to get involved in Syria. 37% say they oppose the president's response to the Syrian government's alleged use of chemical weapons against its own citizens.
Well, the nation this week paused to remember the victims of the September 11th terrorist attack in New York, Washington, D.C., Shanksville, Pennsylvania, and also, just 1 year ago, Benghazi. At Ground Zero, friends and family who lost loved ones read the names of those who died at the World Trade Center that day. Moments of silence were held at both the North and South Tower. Former New York Governor George Pataki was at the World Trade Center ceremony Wednesday morning, and he reflected on the day in this Newsmax exclusive.
Being down there at the memorial above the museum just reminded me of what a tremendous, tremendous achievement it has been, and creating that memorial that is so moving and so powerful, and the museum, which should be opening next year, or that will tell the individual stories of the people who died and the people who responded so heroically. So this is something I know I and most Americans who saw it, whether in person or on television 12 years ago, will never forget.
9/11 also marked the one-year anniversary of the attack on the U.S. mission in Benghazi, Libya, where Ambassador Chris Stevens and 3 others were killed. In a Newsmax exclusive, Representative Frank Wolf tells us why he believes a select committee is needed to investigate what happened.
But there are many people that believe that the annex run by the CIA was being used to collect weapons that were later going on to Turkey and then on to Syria, and not knowing who in the Syrian opposition forces were getting the weapons. So there are a lot of questions. That's why we've been urging and pushing for a select committee.
So far, at least 172 lawmakers have signed on to Wolf's resolution calling for that select committee. And coming up, pulling back the veil of secrecy surrounding the NYPD's counterterrorism surveillance program. Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Matt Apuzzo explains why they add to the ongoing debate of government intrusion.
Plus, reading the tea leaves of entrepreneurship. The founders of Honest Tea turned an idea into a multi-million-dollar business, and they say you can too.
And a revolutionary new surgery is saving the lives of seniors too old or too frail for traditional heart valve surgery. We'll explain how when Newsmax Exclusive returns. And welcome back. While Washington remains focused on Syria, the fight over Obamacare and the continuing resolution to fund the government continues.
Senator Mike Lee, Republican from Utah, says he has gained even more support for his plan to defund Obamacare by voting against the continuing resolution to fund the government, even if it means President Obama will be forced to shut down the government. Senator Lee says that even though a number of Republicans would rather delay Obamacare by a year, he says his plan is gaining broad support.
Well, we have gained some additional support. We're up to 14 signatures among Senate Republicans. We've got about 80 signatures among House Republicans. We've got more in both houses who have indicated privately that they're likely to vote against a continuing resolution, especially one that contains Obamacare implementation funding. But for a variety of reasons, they've chosen not to sign one of these letters. It's really difficult to say, Kathleen, exactly where we are on this. But what I can say is that after traveling throughout my state, the state of Utah, over the last few weeks, I can tell you the people are strongly behind this. From what I hear from my colleagues across the country, the American people generally are against Obamacare, and they don't want Congress to fund it.
Representative Kevin Brady, Republican from Texas and a deputy whip in the House, predicts there will be even more calls to shut down the government to defund Obamacare. He also says Republicans plan to use the upcoming debate to raise the debt ceiling to win additional spending cuts.
Between the CR and the debt ceiling, there's two real opportunities to address the size and the power and the scope of this government to right size us back down into something that's actually sustainable. These are two tremendous opportunities that we can't let go past. So the spending cuts, the real reforms to save the entitlement programs and tax reform, those are pretty powerful approaches.
Representative Brady, who chairs the Joint Economic Committee, also tells Newsmax that he favors tying any continuing resolution to fund the government to a definitive timetable for tax reform.
And the New York City Police Department's counterterrorism and surveillance programs are troublesome and add to the ongoing debate about government intrusion. That, according to Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter Adam Goldman and Matt Apuzzo. Their new book, Enemies Within, Inside the NYPD's Secret Spying Unit in Bin Laden's Final Plot Against America. It takes a hard look at the NYPD's attempts to create its own version of the CIA in New York City and the toll their methods are taking on the privacy rights of American citizens. New York City Police Commissioner Ray Kelly has defended his department's surveillance programs, saying that they have produced results. But Apuzzo disputes Kelly's assessment.
Well, I hope he reads the book. I think the idea that it's lawful is kind of a little bit of a red herring. We're not saying it's illegal. This isn't a story about, this isn't a story about, oh, look, the NYPD is violating the law. This is again, to parallel to the NSA debate that's going on in Washington. This is a book that talks about where we are, what we've made legal, what we've accepted as a society, what we've allowed our government to do on its own people, and that's an important discussion to have. We have a police department now in New York City who was keeping files on what people in the United States thought about George W. Bush's State of the Union address. And the idea was, well, they were, in a Pakistani neighborhood and they were speaking Urdu, but they're watching the State of the Union address and they're talking about, their political views, and that ends up in police files. So the idea of a police department keeping files on what people think about the State of the Union address really goes to the heart of what we want from our government.
Now, one of the most notable cases handled by the NYPD's counterterrorism unit was the investigation of Najibullah Zazi, considered the single greatest al-Qaeda threat since 9/11. He had plans to detonate bombs in the New York City subway system in 2009. The police and the CIA infiltrated his mosque and collected data on the plot. Zazi was arrested after he was tipped off about their surveillance, and Apuzzo said that investigation, though, still yielded almost zero actionable intelligence.
Najibullah Zazi was the single greatest al-Qaeda threat to the United States since 9/11. This is a guy in New York City, radicalized, became anti-American, flew out to Pakistan, got trained by one of Osama bin Laden's top deputies, and comes back to the United States primed to carry out a suicide bombing on the New York City subways. This is exactly what the NYPD Intelligence Division, with the help from the CIA, was established to stop. So it was first of all, it's an amazing success story in the counterterrorism world, but it also allows us to really take a look at, well, what worked and what didn't. And the NYPD, as you say, they had infiltrated Zazi's mosque. They had infiltrated one of his co-conspirators' students groups. They had infiltrated, they had turned one of his imams into a cooperative. They had infiltrated the travel agency. They had monitored the travel agency where he bought his tickets to Pakistan. And at every stage, these programs that were designed to catch terrorists, they failed to catch this guy. And yet they contributed more and more files on American citizens who had just no connections to terrorism whatsoever.
Now, this has also become an issue in the NYC mayor's race. This is Republican Joe Lhota here. He won the Republican primary and has said that he agrees with the NYPD's controversial surveillance tactics. Democrat Bill de Blasio, who earned the most votes in the Democratic primary, strongly opposes those tactics, as well as the NYPD's stop and frisk technique. So the final outcome of this mayor's race could potentially have a huge impact on the NYPD. We'll see what happens there. Now, coming up in a Money News exclusive today, should President Obama use the U.S. monetary policy to punish Vladimir Putin? Our own David Nelson explains why one hedge fund manager backs such a plan.
Plus, we'll read the tea leaves with the co-founders of Honest Tea. They'll explain how they turned their idea into a multi-million-dollar business and explain why they say you can do it too when Newsmax Exclusive returns. And welcome back. In case you missed it, how Washington responded to talk of a strike on Syria mattered a lot to investors and Wall Street.
That's right, and one financial strategist is suggesting President Obama utilize a weapon of mass currency appreciation in his dealings with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Newsmax contributor David Nelson joins us now from New York City with an exclusive interview with Hedgeye CEO Keith McCullough. David, what did you learn?
Hey, John. Hi, Kathleen. I had a chance to interview Hedgeye's Keith McCullough this week. Now, Keith is very well thought of in the investment community, and he's one of those pundits that tends to think outside the box. And last week, he had a very interesting article how President Obama could use a strong dollar policy to rein in Russian President Vladimir Putin and his rhetoric. And lo and behold, in the last several days, the Russian president has stepped into the mix, and he's actually even had an op-ed in the New York Times. What a strong dollar would do is it would force oil down because oil is priced in dollars. That's their principal export, and it might give them pause.
Yeah, at the end of the day, I mean, you sit there and you look at Putin and he's pushing us around. And I think that the number one weapon that we have as a country that neither Bush or Obama has used is called a weapon of mass currency appreciation, the dollar. Now, Putin doesn't exist. You know, Chavez and his former self wouldn't have existed. Neither do these Middle Eastern overlords that capitalize on oil if a weak dollar doesn't exist. So what I would say to Mr. Putin, I'd say, look, Vlad, I'm going to taper, then I'm going to tighten, then I am going to knock that price of oil back into the stratosphere of where you used to be, and we're going to have a real conversation.
Now, David, if Keith is right on this call that a strong dollar would force oil prices lower, why wouldn't we do it? What's the downside?
The downside is the following. Over the last several years, we've had a weak dollar policy, and a weak dollar is very beneficial for multinational corporations like General Electric, like Honeywell, like Boeing, because a weak dollar makes our goods seem more attractive. So then you have to ask yourself the question, it's kind of a trade-off. Sure, a strong dollar would drive down oil prices. That would translate into probably lower prices at the pump, which kind of acts like a tax on the economy. But on the other side of that, if we lose the weak dollar and our goods aren't as attractive, it could start to hurt exports, and that could translate into lost jobs.
David, one more question for you. If the taper by the Fed is one of the tools used to force the dollar up, which one of the potential candidates to replace Ben Bernanke is most likely to do it, Larry Summers or Janet Yellen?
That's an easy one. That would be Larry Summers. Larry is probably the most likely Fed chairman or potential Fed chairman who would come in, put in the taper, maybe even hike interest rates and force the dollar higher. I know the street would like to see Janet Yellen because she would more than likely carry out current chairman of the Fed, Ben Bernanke's policies that have been in place for over the last half decade. So the quick answer is certainly Larry Summers.
David Nelson in New York, thank you. The co-founders of the organic tea company Honest Tea are hoping entrepreneurs and would-be entrepreneurs can learn from their sweet success. Seth Goldman and Barry Nailbuff began Honest Tea 15 years ago with little more than a tea leaf of an idea and a passion to offer organic, freshly brewed, lightly sweetened bottled tea. And today, Honest Tea has exploded into a national brand sold in more than 100,000 grocery stores, convenience stores, and restaurants across the country. In a Money News exclusive, I started by asking them what is their best advice for entrepreneurs.
Certainly, for me personally, it's been build something you believe in. Not just something you believe in 50% of the time. Build something you're passionate about. Because going into it as an entrepreneur, you're always going to have the disadvantage. You're not going to have the resources. You're not going to have the information. You're going to have cost disadvantages, distribution disadvantages. Pretty much everything entering is going to be at a disadvantage. So the one advantage you have is a belief that you can inspire your employees, that you can engage your customers and your consumers in a way that they, if you do it right, will care about you in a way they wouldn't care about another product.
And Barry, with today's political and economic climate, do you think that the age of entrepreneurship has passed, or do you think it can be fixed?
Well, I think we're seeing it everywhere, that this is, when people don't have other opportunities, this is the time to take the gamble on yourself, to bet on your ideas. And the opportunities that exist for new businesses, unbelievable today.
Seth Goldman and Barry Nailbuff are sharing tips for their success in a new book they co-wrote called Mission in a Bottle.
That makes me thirsty watching that.
It's good stuff.
Well, approximately 5 million people are diagnosed with heart valve disease each year. Now, a new surgery is saving the lives of seniors who may have been too frail for traditional open heart surgery. An exclusive Newsmax health report coming up.
And welcome back. A revolutionary new procedure shows promise in saving the lives of seniors too frail for heart valve surgery.
That's right. Doctors at Henry Ford Hospital in Detroit have created a new route to the heart to implant an artificial heart valve by temporarily connecting major blood vessels that do not normally intersect. Complicated stuff. Dr. William O'Neill pioneered the world's first cardiac procedure and operating on a 79-year-old back in July when it became evident to him that other means would not work.
So we came up with a new technique for being able to put the valve in by a new method of crossing from the main vein in the stomach across to the aorta, and then putting the valve up into the heart through the aorta and repairing. It's never been done before in humans, and it's actually worked very dramatically and very successfully.
Dr. O'Neill estimates that this new procedure could help 25,000 to 50,000 patients each year in the U.S. Already, the method has saved the lives of a half a dozen patients, in some cases increasing lifespan by an estimated 15 years.
We've already seen 6 patients that were candidates, and we've treated 5 others, again with very good success. So we're going to be continuing to do this, and we're going to invite other centers around the country to learn how to do the procedure.
And here's a look at what's coming up in next week's edition of Newsmax Exclusive. Senator Rand Paul, Republican from Kentucky, joins us. We'll get his take on Syria and the latest developments in Washington.
Plus, we'll hear from former U.S. Navy SEAL Brandon Webb. He lost his best friend in the Benghazi attack. We'll get his reaction to a call for a special committee in the House to investigate what happened. That and more on next week's edition of Newsmax Exclusive. And be sure to stay with Newsmax.com for the latest developments on the ongoing crisis in Syria and for more news you can use. And that'll do it for this edition of Newsmax Exclusive.
Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you next week.
Take care.